The views expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of our training institutions or the APA. The information discussed is intended for educational purposes only and should not be used for diagnosis or treatment. Enjoy! And just a content warning before we begin. We're going to be discussing sexual assault and suicide on today's episode, which may not be appropriate for all listeners. If you or someone you know is considering suicide, contact the National Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-8255 or the crisis text line by texting HOME, HOME, to 741-741. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again here on the AJP Residence Journal. My name is Bharat Sampathi. I'm one of the editorial board members. This is part 2 of our series on sports psychiatry. Some of you may have listened to our earlier podcast in July, where I interviewed Dr. Bettina Frankel from Northwestern University on the topic of sports psychiatry. Today, we have an opportunity to continue the discussion on mental health in sports with a student athlete directly. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Priya Gearin. Priya, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Yeah, happy to be talking to you guys tonight.
Excited as well. Do you mind introducing our guest?
I would love to. Sydney Wetterstrom is currently a Division I beach volleyball player for Florida State and was a 4-year varsity player on the women's indoor volleyball team at the University of Michigan. During her time at Michigan, she was academic all Big Ten each year she was eligible, Michigan's Big Ten sportsmanship winner, and one of 5 awardees of the National Association of Academic and Student Athlete Development Professionals' prestigious Student Athlete Achievement Award. And, as we'll be discussing in today's podcast, Sydney is also a sexual assault survivor, activist, and a mental health advocate.
Thank you, Priya. Sydney, so I just wanted to start by asking how you're doing today. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, yeah, I'm doing really well. It's great to be on this podcast. I think it's amazing that you guys have put this together.
Thank you for the kind words. We're so glad to have you on the podcast. How does it feel to have graduated from Michigan?
Yes, I guess I graduated from the University of Michigan for my undergrad, yet I'm not finished there. I'm pursuing a master's in social work here at Florida State. And so it's just one step closer to my goal, but it's great to finish that chapter in my life and move on to something next.
That's great. You must be very excited to be continuing your volleyball career at Florida State.
Yeah, I'm extremely excited. I think the program here is super competitive. They've been ranked top 5 in the nation the past 3-4 years, and so to be a part of something that great is always wonderful.
So before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why Priya and I wanted to do this podcast. In our opinion, the public tends to see Division I athletes at big-time programs like University of Michigan and Florida State as, these physical specimens with tremendous athletic ability. While this is true, people can tend to gloss over the fact, in my opinion, that there's an immense amount of hard work that goes on behind the scenes to develop these athletic talents and prowess. And it can be easy to assume that athletes are successful people living happy lives at the center of attention. In other words, with really nothing to worry about. So part of my reason for wanting to interview you, Sydney, is to highlight the fact that athletes are people just like me, just like Priya, just like everyone else. And part of being a person involves mental illness, and that includes athletes. Whether you're on the court or in a cubicle, mental health really doesn't discriminate. And I hope for trainees like Priya and myself, this podcast sheds light on the importance of sports psychiatry and understanding the minds of student athletes as it relates to mental health, and also serving athletes as mental health professionals.
Thanks so much for capturing all that, Bharat. So, Sydney, you have been very open about your difficult experiences in college, but I wanted to start with what your transition to college as a Division I athlete was like for you. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the first few months after setting foot in Ann Arbor, knowing that, the transition of going to college itself can cause a lot of anxiety, and I imagine that's even harder when you're attending a really big school like the University of Michigan.
Yeah, I think one thing that I kind of embraced to a fault was fake it till you make it. They tell you once you step on campus to compartmentalize and to get everything that you have under control, your stress, your schoolwork, sport. And I faked it till I made it to almost the extent of complete disaster. I faked happiness, I faked confidence, And it truly came back to bite me, especially coming onto campus. I grew up in Longmont, Colorado, which is a smaller city, to Ann Arbor, which is this beautifully diverse city with so much going on culturally and academically and athletically. It was extremely stressful. I wasn't too much homesick in that regard, but just it was a huge adjustment being from the star in your high school and being like the athlete of the year to stepping on campus and having seniors ahead of you in your position, and you have to pay your dues and you have to just respect the journey. And whether it was being thrown into something that I wasn't anticipating, I experienced severe anxiety and severe depression without even knowing. You learn in psych classes, like your psych 101 or something, what anxiety is and what depression is, and they say, oh, here's the symptoms. And yet you don't really associate with it. You're in, at least for me, I was in extreme denial, and I was like, no, like that's not me. That's not at all. Like the thought never even crossed my mind that I was dealing with such poor mental health.
I'm pretty sure you're not the only one who's felt like that, felt so isolated, and especially when everyone around you is probably faking it till they make it too. That really makes a lot of sense.
And I also think as you mentioned, coming as a big fish in a small pond, and then going to a huge school like University of Michigan, where as a freshman you start off as a little fish in a big pond with a lot of other very talented, smart people, I can really see how it can be overwhelming. And, when I was speaking to Dr. Frankel in my earlier podcast, she was saying, athletes really have two full-time jobs. It's not just functioning academically, but you also have to function athletically. So, while I didn't experience it, I mean, I can imagine how much pressure there probably was to be able to perform in class, perform on the court, maintain a social life. Was it hard to kind of balance all those things?
Yeah, I call it the trifecta. So you have sports, school, and social life. You hit it right on the head. And typically you got two going in the right direction and one's always tanking. Maybe your sport, you're competing really well in the gym. Maybe academically you're turning in assignments and you're getting rewarded for it. But then socially, that's where it takes a hit. Or maybe socially you're partying up, you're having fun, you're making new friends, and that can help your athletics, like you're bounding and having great relationships with your teammates, yet maybe academic struggling. So I think in order to have those three balanced, that's almost impossible as a freshman. You're going to kind of have priorities, and I think as along with the fake it till you make it, you think you're balancing all three, you think you are, and then you kind of realize something's slipping. And at that point, for me, it was too late. I was academically doing fine. Socially was thrown into the loop, had great teammates, great friends, so that was fine. But athletically, I was struggling. For me, that's where my whole identity was tied in. I was always a starter in high school ever since a freshman. And my identity was this amazing athletic weapon, this person that's always competing, this person who is driven for success. And when I wasn't able to execute that and I was sitting on the bench, I felt lost. I didn't know who I was anymore. And I don't think really that lessons taught to young athletes. I don't think people realize you are so much more than just an athlete until you really have to grow up and kind of understand you're human. You're not put on this earth to score X amount of points or to be in the starting lineup. You're on this earth to inevitably struggle. I think everyone is designed to struggle, and it's how you bounce back from those struggles and how do you improve and how do you adapt.
So Sydney, how about during the rest of college? We kind of talked about what it was like starting out and kind of getting settled. And in an article on the Athletes Connected website, you stated you stumbled, tumbled, and fell hard. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of what happened?
Yeah, so I have to say my freshman year, you're thrown into it. You're in the dorms, you make friends and everything. The timing is iffy, whether I imagine I was probably struggling even before, but I was sexually assaulted my freshman year.
Wow.
And I think after that, again, I was in denial that it happened. I was in denial that I was having anxiety and PTSD, and I was in denial that I was depressed. And I remember there were times before practice where like I would get so wound up that like I felt like my whole body was spinning. Yeah, I was standing completely still. And it was almost like a tornado of thoughts and a tornado of fear and guilt and shame. And I believe that's now in hindsight, I believe that was probably anxiety attacks. And they'd happen before practice because that was a time where like you have to get your blood pumping, you have to be aggressive, and you have to kind of give that fight or flight response. However, that fight or flight response is similar to what happens when you're sexually assaulted. It's that life or death feeling. And for me, it was too similar. And again, I didn't know exactly what was going on. I just was faking it until I made it. I remember I was all freshmen, I think, were asked to attend this like stress seminar, and they had older athletes there who were like mentors, and they were asking us, so what do you do when you're stressed out? They were trying to help us out and trying to give us tips and skills. And I was in so much denial. I was like, oh, well, I actually don't get stressed. And I was like, I don't get stressed. Like, that is not for me. And the person who was like the mentor looked me in the eye and like blinked a couple times and was just like obviously was like reading through my lies and just like totally was like, okay, we're going to the next question. Like, I can't deal with this because no one is fully stress free.
Right.
That was just my life. I wore a mask for a lot of it. I kept secrets, and a lot of that went down to just old habits. I talk about it in the article. Ever since I was a sophomore in high school, I struggled with an eating disorder. And so that was always coming through my life at extremely stressful situations. Because for me, it was something that I could control in a way. It was like, if I ate this food, I can control like I could control pulling the trigger and vomiting. And that was my idea of control. If everything else is hectic, that's something that I have control in.
Yeah, Sydney, I've noticed that during my time in residency, with clients specifically struggling with eating disorders, when the world is spinning and everything feels out of control, restricting food intake and purging seems to be the one way some clients feel in control. Yeah. So honestly, it makes sense that this was resurfacing for you during these times.
Extremely, extremely unhealthy.
Yeah.
So another transition that was extremely stressful was moving out of the dorm. So after my freshman year, I had moved out of the dorms. I was alone in this new house. I had, again, PTSD. I was extremely stressed, and it resulted in me attempting to take my own life.
Wow.
I hit rock bottom. I remember just thinking, I don't know what else to do. This pain was unbearable, and it wasn't physical. It's not like a sprained ankle where it swells up and it turns blue and purple and you're like, oh, like, okay, like it's gonna get better. But this is deep, deep emotional pain that was rooted at my core.
Sydney, I want to take a moment to commend you for being so open regarding your sexual assault. It's because of people like you, people that are strong enough to speak out regarding sexual assault, that gives others with similar experiences the hope and strength to advocate for themselves, the hope and strength to fight. Also, refusing to let an event control or define their lives. It's so great to see you now thriving and going to grad school, continuing to play volleyball as well. And it sounds like Sydney, it sounded like just things started to snowball once you started your freshman year of college, adjusting to college.
I was just like numb to everything, like wasn't responding, wasn't eating. I was just like just exactly a zombie, just kind of like groaning and in so much pain, laying in bed. And a teammate was like, hey, like, I love you. I care so much about you. If you're not going to help yourself for yourself, I need you to at least go get help for myself. So I remember seeing the psychologist in athletics and then going to the hospital and spending about a week probably in the psychiatric ward of University of Michigan's hospital.
How did you feel afterwards, after this experience and having some time to reflect?
I have to say the diagnosis of severe anxiety and major depressive disorder was relieving. I thought it was just me. I thought only Sydney Wetterstrom was going, not to be entitled, but I just was like, I don't know anyone else no one in my family has talked about it. It was very taboo growing up. I remember being at a kitchen table and bawling my eyes out and probably exhibiting anxiety and depression, just telling my mother how much I hated myself and how much I hated my body and how much just I felt worthless. And it was just like, oh my God, calm down, like shush, like it's not that bad. Again, fake, I guess the whole fake it till you make it, just smile. And so once I got that diagnosis, I was like, okay, so there's something to do about this. I don't have to be living this lifestyle. I don't have to be struggling to continue my life. And got on medication. At least for me, in my experience with it, it was very frustrating. You get put on an antidepressant and then I'd be super lethargic and didn't have much energy. And then they put you on a stimulant, but yet with the stimulant, I was
Mm-hmm.
having actually pretty bad side effects. I couldn't sleep then. So then they put me on a sleeping medication, and then that sleeping medication was causing terrible for me, it was so much to handle. Like, I feel like I needed a Google Calendar just to control just to control when and what amount to take it. And I think it probably does help some people, but for me, it was more of a stress to keep that manageable than anything. And again, I'm a full-time student, a full-time athlete. Was in 20 hours a week. I was in 16 credits. And then also just trying to be a 19, 20-year-old. It was so much to handle. And okay, so another thing that they don't tell you, or I guess I had to learn on my own, is whenever a season ends, your body kind of has adverse effects. Because we finished my season my sophomore year. Your schedule changes. You have about maybe a month where you're not going to practice. You're on Christmas break. And so when I came back, actually, then I was trying to come back from winter break and adjust back to classes, adjust back to academics. That whole transition period set me off. Like, whether it's, I don't know, you guys are the experts of this. And I actually attempted again. And you question, like, how did it get that bad? Like, how? Because life is so precious and life is so beautiful. And you're just like, how you survive something. And you're just like, I could easily not be here. And so that was extremely enlightening. And I think that second attempt, as severe as it was, probably got me on the right track.
After you mentioned that the second attempt had actually gotten you on the right track, I was wondering if you could expand on that and maybe talk about what changed after that second experience.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I was seeing a counselor twice a week. I was seeing them regularly. I had actually changed counselors. It was actually a good transition to be speaking with someone else and to work through things, and like to get different therapies, whether it's dialectic behavioral therapy or is cognitive behavioral therapy, and just like having another opinion and just another person to bounce ideas off and like to think of where you are at and everything.
Yeah, and Priya, you probably have heard about this too as a trainee yourself, but I've always learned that sometimes it takes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 therapists before you find someone that really connects with you, someone that you're very comfortable to share your experiences with. So I'm wondering if that might have been something, Sydney, that you experienced. You finally found someone that really understood what you were going through.
Yeah, I'd have to say so. I'm glad it didn't take 7. I'm glad it didn't take 3. To finally have something click was very satisfying.
Sydney, I'm wondering, it took quite a few steps to kind of get the help you needed. And was there anybody along the way before that, like a coach or advisor, who kind of also stepped in at any point? And like, I don't know, maybe you can comment too on, do you feel like there is stigma in college athletics with mental health?
I've heard horror stories of there's stigmas where coaches are like, oh, where coaches say put a Band-Aid on it, but I thankfully didn't have that experience. My coaches were extremely open. I remember my head coach came to see me when I was in the hospital, and he was just like the same analogy I used before, like the ankle analogy. He was like, hey, like, you're gonna go through this, you're gonna succeed, you're gonna fall sometimes, but like, I fully believe you and everything that you've gone through, and this is no different than if you did roll your ankle and you were needing surgery or you were needing certain medical care. This is just as important. Your physical and mental health are equally important. And I had so much support. Oh my gosh, my coaches were absolutely amazing. So with the whole medication thing, there were times where we'd have a 10 a.m. practice and my medication made me sleep in until 10:15 or 10:30. I'd wake up extremely drowsy. I'd have our athletic trainer would come knock. She knew where I live, and again, probably was like, what is Sydney doing again? Like, what's going on? And she'd knock on my door. She'd wake me up and say, hey, Sydney, we have practice. And I'd be like, oh, like, I was just trying a new prescription, and I fell asleep. And it was never, I'd come into practice just bawling my eyes out because I was so scared that I was gonna like let the team down, or so scared that I like was gonna frustrate the coaches. And my coach would like just hug me and be like, I'm just glad you're here, like, you're okay, like, we completely understand you. It's not like you intentionally are sleeping in. It's not like you were out the night before partying, drinking. You are doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. And so Stigma, I think, for me, left when I came to college. So you asked me if I had a coach or if I had a counselor, if I had a mentor that recommended, and yeah, I did. But again, I ignored it. I wasn't open to the idea that my mental health or whatever mental health was as an 18, 19-year-old was going to hold me back. So I'm probably looking back on it, I wish I did probably get the help, because that was even prior to my sexual assault and prior to my attempts. It's great to have that relationship with a counselor or a therapist before something terrible happens.
Yeah, it's kind of like addressing the symptoms or the experiences as they occur rather than letting them build up and get to a boiling point later on, right?
100%. Yeah, because there's a bunch of trauma as a child. Say I had discussed that prior to my sexual assault, I would have handled the sexual assault way differently.
Yeah.
I would have had them be separate incidents. I would not have associated them together. I would have been able to say, well, this happened then, but it does not mean it caused this. Mental health is so hard because it's not something that you can physically grasp. Like, I was in the best shape of my life as a freshman. I was in a gym with amazing athletes. I was doing conditioning and lifting with people who've worked with the Olympians. And so physically I was on my A game. I was amazing. But mentally, oh my gosh, mentally it was a train wreck.
Yeah. And Sydney, I'm kind of curious. You mentioned behavioral therapy, like CBT. What's kind of been your experience of therapy and CBT in particular?
I did DBT and CBT. So my first psychologist was actually really big into CBT. And so just you're obviously like, how are your thoughts affecting your behavior? So for me, my thoughts and my negative self-talk were pretty much strictly associated with my body image and what I had been told as a child and what was the expectations of how you should look and how you should talk and how you should interact with people. And I had these expectations that were unrealistic. In order to be an elite athlete, you're going to have to be muscular. And for me, I was always told that being muscular is manly, and it was poor. It was not exactly desirable. And so, but I've grown and changed the thought process and saying, like, my body has allowed me to do amazing things. It still allows me to do amazing things. So, yeah, I feel like a lot of my truth, which weren't really truth, were rooted down into that and rooted down into like acceptance of what had been told to me as a child. And yeah, I think just kind of like dissociating those conversations with where I am now was allowed me to kind of like release and like forgive and forget and let go.
Yeah, it sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy was really valuable for you in terms of identifying cognitive distortions that you built and almost cemented to a certain extent growing up. And it really allowed you to kind of slowly break away those distortions and really understand how to truly think about yourself and your body and move forward in a more positive light.
Yeah, completely.
I wanted to spend some time going back and talking about how your athletic performance specifically was affected by your mental health.
Focus was complete. Focus was completely. I was having, again, the whole physiological responses, that fight or flight, which are amazing when you're competing. When you need to run down a ball because it's the only thing that's going to get it up, you're going. But yet, every time I felt an elevated heart rate or my respiratory rate to increase, I associated and generalized every man there was. So I was being extremely disrespectful and wasn't making eye contact with any of my male coaches because that was just too personal. And so I wasn't focusing. They'd be talking directly to me and I'm looking at my feet. So I remember being in practice and it was a drill, and I was again like a zombie, like just was like this depressed, this just really no emotion, just blah person.
So Sydney, tell me a little bit about the Student Athlete Sexual Health initiative that you started.
So I remember being on the computer. You had computer hours, which you could only be on a computer for 15 minutes at a time in the psychiatric ward. And just Googling like any female athletes or any athletes, it didn't matter, that were handling sexual assault, and got very, very limited results, and was looking at like different therapies or different like support groups, and there wasn't really anything. And at this point, I was discharged, and I just was tired of living a life full of secrets And so I remember posting, just saying like, hey, like this is what I've gone through. This is what's happened. Like the man who assaulted me isn't going to take my voice away. One of my other fellow student athletes messaged me back and was like, hey, you are so courageous. I appreciate this. Let's grab coffee. So we grabbed coffee. We share similar stories and same kind of goals. We're like, there needs to be something better out there for student athletes that are affected by sexual assault. And so that created Student Athlete Sexual Health. Fast forward 2 years, we've made it an official LLC for it. We're making a workbook for it and everything. But this group is pretty much designed to be a confidential, a safe place for student athletes with similar traumas to come together and to not feel alone, because that was the biggest thing. Like I didn't know what to do. And I knew statistically other people had felt the same or had gone through the same thing that I had gone through. And like my thing is, I didn't want anyone to ever feel the way I had felt. I didn't want anyone to ever go down the rabbit hole as far as I went. And so I'm thankful that my co-founder reached out to me and we created this group, and then we created a program for it. And so when we graduate, it can be implemented. And then now our goals are to have it implemented at any other university that desires our services.
It's so awesome that you're doing this, and I think it'll be very, very, very valuable to any school in the nation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just so glad that this initiative has allowed you to connect with other people that have had similar experiences. For athletes that maybe struggle with stigma against mental illness, either culturally or in their family, and are coming out of high school and starting college, do you have any advice for people like this?
We as a society want to always have that highlight reel. We see it with social media. We always post happy stuff. We always post the grad pics, and we post the new job, and we post a new car, and all these different highlights. And that's not real life. Real life has blemishes. Real life has cracks. And I think to just accept them and to find the beauty in it and to find the joy, accept it and know that there's things that you can't control, and to find comfort in the unknown. And so I guess my biggest advice is to never stop searching for that one person, or searching for someone to listen. It may not be a family member. I've always said the family you create is greater than the family you are given. And I think as an athlete, we get so caught up on the numbers, and we get so caught up on the fame and what's in the contract and everything like that. And we don't really take into account that life is just full of relationships. Whether someone's in your life for 5 minutes or someone's in your life for 5 years or 50 years, it's the relationships that kind of carry us through.
One of the last questions we had is, Priya and I are still residents, meaning we're psychiatrists in training. So in a couple years, we'll be, full on psychiatrists working with patients, and we'll have licenses. And I wanted to see if you had any thoughts or recommendations on how we can carry ourselves when we work with college students, college athletes, high school students, high school athletes.
So yeah, I had a psychiatrist. Obviously, he prescribed me my medicine and everything like that. And he was extremely steady, and he was extremely consistent, and that was reliable. I joke around about it. I would always have the worst luck whenever I had an appointment with him. Like one time I was riding my bike to the doctor's office and I fell and I came in scraped up and everything. And like another time I came in, it was downpouring, so I looked like a wet dog. And then other times I'd be like crying and my eyes were puffy, or I'd be like, for some reason, whenever I had an appointment, I just was always like, looked like this homeless person that came walking in. And he would never blink an eye. Never. It was always just, hi, like very consistent, very comforting. And I don't know, I think with life, with everything that goes on, the chaoticness of it, to have that just consistency was very, very reliable, and allowed me to kind of be like, well, this is what's happening. And so I knew exactly what I was going to get. I wasn't going in there thinking like, oh, what is he going to say today? Or, oh, is he going to do this and that? Like, it was just like very uniform. And at least for me, I found that to be helpful.
You knew the environment that you were going to go into every time you walked into the office.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Priya, did you have any other questions or things you wanted to ask?
No, I just want to thank you, Sydney, for spending all this time with us and sharing so many really personal parts of your life. I mean, it's really incredible, all the things you've endured and progress you've made over the years to get to this point.
Yeah, and I think, Sydney, your story really shows us as budding psychiatrists that, young adults can flourish and bloom, and and experience success despite high levels of stress, despite mental illness, despite the stress that comes with being a Division I athlete, traumatic events, hospitalizations. And I think it's important for us to keep this in mind as we learn how to treat people now and in the future, knowing that with the right treatment modalities, CBT in your case, young adults can get back on their feet and confidently move forward. And you're a perfect example of this. And what you've done with the Student Athlete Sexual Health Initiative that you started and publishing a booklet that can be dispersed is just absolutely amazing to ultimately help student athletes with similar experiences. So again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, well, thank you, both of you, so much for having me. I think it's amazing that you guys are taking the time to, one, develop these skills and to learn from other people and their life experiences. I think in your profession, that's much needed, just that human interaction. Because like you said, you could have this score on this test and you could have these rounds, and y'all are probably brilliantly smart, but a lot of what goes into helping and caring for people is that emotional intelligence and that emotional connection. And I think everyone's different yet so similar. Everyone's looking for that acceptance and that love and that nourishment. And everyone's going through their own issues. And I think you guys are taking the right steps in understanding people as a holistic entity and knowing that there's so much more to them.
Well, Sydney, I wish you the best of luck with your graduate school and your beach volleyball season. And thank you again to all our listeners for tuning in for another episode of the AJP Residence Journal podcast.